Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and your job is to draw the image that you see. We'll have an artist giving a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Many people choose to watch these videos twice. The first time round, they just watch them, and then the second time round, they watch them and draw along. Once you've finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this Raw Umber online portrait tutorial. This will be a 1-hour pose on white paper and I will be using some willow charcoal. To erase, I like to use a grey putty rubber. And finally, to build up tone and for the details, I will be using this Peel and Sketch compressed charcoal pencil. And I can easily sharpen this using a sharpening pad. Finally, I like to use some blending tools, and this can be anything from a tissue to a stump or even your finger. But I like to use a hog brush and a synthetic brush, just because they both blend a little bit differently. As always, these materials will be available in the materials list below the video, but of course feel free to use whatever you prefer to use. So when I'm drawing, I like to divide my time into 3 equal parts. The first one being the outlay in the drawing, the second being the shapes, and the third being the finish. So first I'm going to start by drawing the outlines. For this, what I find really useful is a center line, which is the line that goes all the way from the middle of the forehead to the bottom of the chin. And this line can be seen as the structure line that holds the features in place. For instance, I can make a line for the bottom of the chin and a line for the bottom of the nose. And then I can use something called comparative measurement, which means that I'm comparing the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin on the photograph, lay my pencil across the photograph, and then take that measurement and see if it can be copied somewhere else. In this case, I can see that the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is the same length as the bottom of the nose to the top of the eyelids. And there are also other places that you may be able to use this measurement. For instance, in my case, I can see that the top of the eyelids to the top of the forehead is roughly the same length as that bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin. That's basically what comparative measurement means. You can just take a random measurement and then compare this to other areas in your drawing. And this doesn't always have to be vertical against other verticals. You can also, for instance, take a vertical measurement like that bottom of the nose to bottom of the chin and turn this 90 degrees and see how it fits in with the width of the face. Now in most faces, and in this face in particular, this measurement of the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is about half the length of the face. So the face is about 2/3 the width compared to the length. So I can just take that and use that from the center line to the outside of the cheekbone. And once I've got these measuring points, I can start looking at the shape of the face. And this is always a little bit different in everyone. Some people have a heart-shaped face, some people have a wider jaw. In this case, I can see that the cheekbones are the widest part of her face, and then it narrows down towards the chin and a jawline. I can also round off the top of the head, again comparing this to the width of the cheekbones. So this is where my drawing process starts to shift a little bit. Up until this point, I've been looking at measurements and lines, and now I want to switch that way of thinking into masses. So instead of using lines to find my measurements, I'm going to use dark and light masses. And a really good example of this is that from the cheekbone to the chin, you can see a big triangle of dark. And I'm just filling this in with the side of my charcoal. And maybe even blend it together a little bit. So instead of using lines to express this, I'm trying to use this dark mass. Now I can do the same thing for the eye sockets. Now it can be very tempting to start working on the eyes and on the brows and detail in the eyes, but first I want to get just my dark masses sorted. So what I like to do for the eyes in particular is just cover them with a soft tone, and later I can cut in with the rubber. And I can use the same method of looking at masses for the hair. And what's so good about this method is that we naturally see dark and light shapes. We don't really see outlines. So when you're actually drawing using mass, you're doing something that's more close to what we visually perceive. And this method actually goes back many years in art history, but particularly around the time of the Impressionists. They found that when photography was invented, they noticed that really all it was dark areas and light areas on the photograph. And they tried to incorporate that in their work. And this is where the pointillist, that impressionist light comes from. It's just patches of light and dark pigments. And the same method is what I use in the charcoal drawing in this style. So I've done all my big blocks of dark, and now I can start working into the smaller blocks. In this case, looking at the shadow on the side of the nose. Same thing for the mouth. I try not to outline the mouth. Instead, I just find the top lip, the shape of that top lip, and the shape of the shadow just underneath the bottom lip. And this can actually show the lips in a very easy and quick way without having to use outlines. If you're having trouble seeing these shapes, squinting can be really handy because it compresses all the values or the tones together, so all you see is abstract dark and light shapes. You can also use a mirror or even your phone to flip the image upside down, which helps make the portrait into an abstract arrangement of shapes. And as you can see, even though I've only really been drawing triangles and squares in terms of dark and light shapes, a portrait is slowly starting to emerge from the drawing. Now, a little note about outlines in the dark areas. Try not to go in with a dark tone inside of the shadows. So if you have the dark of the hair next to the dark of the jawline, the instinct can be to use a rubber in there to make it lighter or to put dark accents in there. At this stage of the drawing, I actually try not to do this. And the reason for this is that it can overcomplicate the drawing. So I try to hold back at this stage of the drawing and try to only think in terms of light shapes, dark shapes, and no detail in the darks and no detail in the lights. Now earlier, I was speaking about how I just used a little bit of dark to completely draw in those eye sockets, and now is a good time to start pulling out the lighter shapes using a rubber. And just by pulling out a light shape for the top lid and a light shape for the bottom lid, you can already see an eye is starting to form. And really all this shape is just a little triangle or V shape around the shape of the eye. And for this again, I try to really squint down, really only try to think about abstract shapes and just copy those on the paper. As you can see, our brains just fill out the rest of these shapes to create what we know as an eye. And this is actually one of the reasons that people see pictures in clouds, or for instance, pictures in tea stains. This is because our brains are wired to take these abstract shapes and puzzle them together into something that we can understand. And this is something that we can use when we're drawing. So I'm just going to clean some of these shapes up, and while I'm doing this, feel free to ask me any questions at all in the comments if you're watching this live. So now we're about 1/3 into the hour-long pose. I have all my shapes in the right place, or roughly the right place, and I've got the construction of the head and a rough lightness. And now is the time when I'm going to start working in tone, and I'm going to start looking at the edges between dark and light in order to make it more specific and a bit more finished as well. Now, one thing that's useful to remember is that the shadows are always lightest in the middle and darkest around the outer edges. So I can use this knowledge of how light works by going in and making the outside of the shadow a little bit more specific, like I'm doing in the nose, for instance, right now. And I'm trying to take that generic shape that I did earlier and make it a bit more specific to the person that I'm drawing. And you can see that as I work on this outside edge of the shadow, it gets a little bit darker, a little bit more specific, and it makes it look a little bit more real by doing so. So again, I'm not trying to work inside of the shadow here or inside of the light. I'm only looking at that boundary between light and dark shapes. At this point, I'm still using my willow charcoal, but later I may choose to use compressed charcoal. What I'm doing with the lips right now is I'm building up that outside edge of the lips. So I'm going over with my charcoal, making the shape more specific, and then using my blending tool to gently blend this in with the lights. And what this does is that it creates a soft edge that makes it feel like the light slowly merges into that shadow, which makes the drawing feel rounder and more 3D. So I'm just slowly building up that specific edge around the lips, trying to make the lips more like her with every pass. And I'm blending this in using my blending tool. And I'm using a hog brush here, just because it's quite a harsh bristle brush. And that helps me blend the charcoal very softly into the paper, because it doesn't pick up a lot of charcoal. Once I'm happy with this, I can go in with my compressed charcoal, making it just a little bit more specific and a little bit darker. One warning about the compressed charcoal though, I tend to only use it when I'm fairly certain where I'm going to place these darker accents. And this is because it doesn't really erase that well. So I normally always use my willow first and then a compressed charcoal afterwards. And as you can see, the more I work on this, the more round and more realistic the lips feel. I still haven't put anything inside of that shadow shape. I've really only worked on the outside edge of that shadow shape. So this technique of using the compressed charcoal to make my shadow shapes a little bit more specific and to help with the outside edge of that shadow shape, I can also now use in the other features. So for instance, with the nose, I can gently go over that outside edge. And then use my blending tool to gently blend this into the white of the paper, which gives it a bit more of a softer appearance. I can do the same thing with the eyes. So I can use compressed charcoal to figure out the dark accent, in this case the iris. And I can use the blending tool to then blend this into the surrounding area. And I can just keep building up the tone like this. If something is getting too soft, you can use the rubber, or in this case I'm using a synthetic brush as a sort of eraser to sharpen up the tones. Now same thing on the other eye, first figuring out the ridge of the top lid, and then finding the dark accent of the iris. I'm working on shadow shapes. If you're finding that the painting or the drawing starts feeling cloudy, that means you've softened a little bit too much. And if you find that it looks a little bit too drawn and a little bit too cartoonish almost, or graphic, that means you've sharpened everything too much. And the goal is to find a nice balance between the two. So it feels specific, but also very soft at the same time. Something that can also be very powerful is actually losing one shape into another. For instance, right now, I'm losing the iris into the cloudy, dark shape of the side of the head. And this joining up of light or even dark shapes can really help with the realism of the drawing. This helps because in real life we don't always see a perfect outline around every element of the drawing or the portrait. Sometimes things feel a little bit more obscured. So what I tend to do is in every element of the drawing, for instance, right now the eye, I try to look for one very clear shape and one very lost shape, where two shapes lose the tone into each other. So in the eye, I can see that the corner of the eye is very, what I call found, very clear and crisp. And on the other hand, we've got the iris, which slowly loses itself into the rest of the shadow. And the more I can enhance these two extremes, the more realism the drawing will have. So I'm just going to spend a little bit more time on these outside edges of the shadows, and then I will speak to you in a few minutes. If you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments. So up until this point, I've not really worked anywhere else but the features. And this can actually give a very nice focused look to a drawing, where the rest of the hair and the body can be faded out. But another alternative is to start working inside of the shadows. So now I'm going to start working on that area. So first, I'm just adding a bit of tone for the hair. Next, I can use a dark line to separate out the jaw from the rest of the hair. It's very important that I blend this in, because when I squint at the shadow in a photograph, I see the two blur into each other quite quickly, and I want the same effect in a drawing. If there's too much variety in the shadows, and so if you look at the picture, you squint and you see the two blur into each other, but in the drawing they actually stand out quite a lot. This is called over modeling and can really make the drawing look quite flat. For instance, have a look at these two drawings next to each other. The left one, the shadows are very close together. On the right side, we can see the lights have creeped into the darks and the darks have become a bit over-modeled. You can see on the left image, it's very clear where the light is and where the darks are. And on the right-hand side, it's getting a little bit muddled and unclear. So that's something to avoid, and you can avoid this by squinting at the shadows and making sure they're very close together. So I'm now just going to fill in the rest of the darks of the body and the hat, and I will speak to you in a few minutes. Now with the hands, you don't have to actually draw these in. I do have a hand focused video as well, if you're a subscriber, so feel free to check that out. But I'm for now just going to gently block out the main light and dark shapes of the hands in the same method that I did at the start of the portrait. So I've got the rough idea of the shapes, and now I can start using my rubber to pull out the lights of the hand and the fingers. And this can feel very abstract at first. You're really just looking at these abstract shapes again, and especially with hands, that can really look a bit odd at the start. But I find that once I've got all of my main dark and light shapes in for both the top and the bottom hand, things slowly start clicking together. One thing that's important with hands is not to outline each finger. A really good rule of thumb is that all of the shadow shapes should be connected together and all of the light shapes should be connected together. So if I'm going to be outlining the fingers of the hand with a dark line, that breaks up that sense of the light and therefore makes it look more drawn and a little bit flat. So as you can see here, I've really not outlined the fingers. Instead, I've joined up all the lights near the top of the knuckles of the fingers. But still you get a sense of the gesture of the hand and the position of the hand, even without those outlines. Now this is not really a hands video, it's more a video focused on shadow shapes and how to draw using shadow shapes. So I'm going to keep them quite abstract and instead keep focusing on rendering the features. And this brings us to the final stage of the drawing, and that's the rendering stage. And rendering basically means finishing the painting in the style that you like to see. Now, every artist has their own methods, but in this method of using masses of dark and light to describe the portrait, I like to do the same thing but on a smaller scale. So I'm just using the rubber here to pull out smaller light shapes. And as you can see, I can make a big difference in the eye, for instance. Just a little light shape in the iris can say a lot about the reflection of the light in the eye. Now, of course, everyone has different methods of finishing. Some people like a more tighter render, other people like a very loose render, and all of these are very viable methods and are very personal to the artist. But I find that as long as I keep to the rules of masses, dark masses, light masses, using the outline of the shadow to describe things, and joining up my dark shapes and my light shapes, it doesn't really matter what kind of finish I go for. The same underlying principles apply whatever medium, whatever style you end up finishing your drawing in. So I'm just using the compressed charcoal here to bring out sharper edges and darker shapes. And I'm using the willow charcoal if I want the shapes that I make to be a bit softer and a little bit lighter than a compressed charcoal. At this point, you can put a few small details in the shadow, but again, try not to make it too much. Be very cautious about how much detail you put in the shadow, because ultimately our eyes can only focus on one thing at a time. For example, if you're walking into a dark room, your eyes need time to adjust. And similarly, if you then go back into the bright sunshine, your eyes again are a little bit blinded and need to adjust to that light level. And this applies to drawing too. If you put a lot of details in the shadows, then the viewer is going to think that this is the light situation and we should be looking inside of the shadows. And if you then also put a lot of detail in the lights, that throws the viewer off because we can't naturally focus on both shadow and light. So again, when I am adding these small accents in the shadow, I'm always very cautious of overdoing it. I'm constantly squinting to make sure that everything joins up together in the same way as it does on the photograph. When drawing the hair, try not to call too much attention to the hair itself. Again, this is of secondary importance to the drawing. Normally, in a portrait drawing, the main focus should be the eyes and the features. So even though there's a lot going on in the hair in terms of textures, I try to downplay this in order to make the viewer focus on the portrait itself. So I may end up using a few loose lines to indicate the texture of the hair, but I'm really cautious of overdoing it and bringing too much focus in that area. And remember how I was speaking about joining up the light shapes and joining up the dark shapes? You can do the same thing with the hair. So the light is coming from the top left. And so I can use my rubber to remove some of that shadow in the hair there and join up the light shape of the forehead, the light shape in the hair, and even the light in the background. And this serves a few purposes. The first thing it does is it adds more power and more impact to the light, because the light is now joined up together and become a bigger shape. And it also adds to the realism by losing some of the outlines. So as we're almost at the end of the pose, I'm going to just continue drawing these shapes, these highlights, and join up my darks and lights together. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions about finish or anything else, let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. And otherwise, I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the post. Thank you so much for watching. And I hope that you feel like you've learned something about how to draw in mass and how to also finish using mass drawing. If you'd like to show off your artwork, feel free to use the photograph button in the chat. And otherwise use the hashtag #RawUmberLife if you use Instagram.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLife. Goodbye. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.